developing your internal supervisor. There's an internal supervisor, Rory.
There is an internal supervisor. So anybody who studies counselling or psychotherapy, right from the early, the introduction courses, will soon come to realise that supervision is an integral part of being a therapist. You go every month for a fixed amount of time to see a supervisor and discuss your clinical work. And that acts like a check and balance to make sure that you are working in the best interests of the client, and also that you have somebody who is a critical friend who can maybe guide you onto a different path or to give you some feedback. It's the essential part of being a therapist. It's an ethical imperative, no matter which ethical framework you practice under, and something that I've been undergoing for the last 20 years. So it is a useful and essential part of being a therapist. But sometimes your therapist isn't available. Certainly if you're sat in the therapy room and something happens, you have to make a decision. And that's when you call on something called your internal supervisor. And I found a wonderful quote from Patrick Casement, who's a psychoanalyst who coined the phrase internal supervisor. And this is from his book, Learning from the Patient, that was published in 1985. And he says, "For monitoring the psychotherapy process, I've relied a lot on a clinical discipline I call internal supervision. This is how I have come to monitor my own work and the clinical work of those who present to me in supervision or in clinical seminars. It's an important part of internal supervision is something called trial identifying with the patient. This means putting myself in the position of the patient in order to monitor my own part in the clinical process, considering how they may be experiencing my input into the session. And another part of internal supervision is to look for unconscious prompts from the patient that can help me recognize when a patient is being affected by me in ways I had not meant and not anticipated." And just a footnote to that, Casement uses the term patient because in psychoanalytic therapy, they're sometimes referred to as patient. In counselling, we talk about the clients. And we get a sense from this statement and the idea of an internal supervisor is this is like a little person that sits on your shoulder and ticks away and interrupts you subconsciously and asks you questions and prompts you when you're in the therapy room. It's like an internal therapeutic conscience. And that develops through the arc of your training. For those who are just going into practice, it may be not very well defined, but after a few years, the internal supervisor becomes quite a strong configurative voice within you and is able to kind of think, oh, I wonder if I've just done that and that's why the client's reacted. Or, oh, I've just said that and maybe I should just check on that. And it's very, very useful. And it speaks, I think, Ken, to the fact that our supervisor isn't always around. So sometimes as we develop as practitioners, we have to make some calls ourselves, things around confidentiality or interventions we may use in the service of the client.
Wow. It's such an important and interesting topic that you've brought this morning, Rory, and I like that you said that it is dependent on maturity, and you'll find that the more mature you are in your practice, the more you may be able to key into that. And I love the way you voiced it, Rory, that configuration of self, which is another theory. It's those many voices within. It's that part within the session where something clangs, something doesn't feel 100% right, or there may be an area of danger, or there may be a security issue. It's kind of being there with the client 100%, but also part of you overseeing the relationship and having a look at what is going on there. If a client starts speaking about something that may break a confidentiality boundary within your contract, you might be going, what do I need to look out for this? How do I hold this? And it can sound quite, I guess, daunting as we're speaking about it now. As I'm saying it, I'm thinking, wow, that sounds really tricky. But I guess it becomes more and more natural, Rory. It's kind of it's not quite gut, but but you might get an indication from your gut to be in that supervisory position within your own practice.
Yeah, I think it's a dual process, Ken. I think you're absolutely right. It is a visceral gut feeling, but I also think it's a cognitive feeling, because we're having to draw on ethical frameworks, our theories, our contract. So there is a fair amount of thought process in that. But what's very, very useful with this internal supervisor, or developing the internal supervisor, is that then gives you food for discussion when you meet your supervisor. So you may write that up in your personal notes, in your personal journal, and then take that to your supervisor and say, when I was working with this client, this happened. This process is what happened. This is where I found myself in. This is what I did. And the supervisor, because they're external to you, can then kind of look at that with you and try and work out what generated the actions you took, or the discomfort you felt, or even the uncertainty. I think that, as therapists, sometimes we work with a lot of uncertainty, and we have to kind of manage that. So it's a very, very useful process. And I think that supervisors should help actively develop the internal supervisor. I know that I do in my supervisees. I say, what does that tell you? Before I give them an answer or give them an observation, I will ask them, what does that tell you? What do you think's going on for you there? And together we can kind of work it out together. And that then feeds and provides nourishment for the internal supervisor. And it's interesting, I've supervised for many years students who are now, well qualified, well experienced practitioners, and it's noticeable their internal supervisor is very active, very present, and always presents in supervision, as it does in therapy, Ken.
I like it. And, it's about being a reflective and reflexive practitioner. We've spoken about this before on the podcast. Reflective after the session, thinking about how that went, what came up for you. Was there anything that came up from the client? And this is outside of just keeping the client notes and preparing for your next client. It's really going into that and having a look. And maybe there are natural signs to that internal supervisor. So the client may present with something that you haven't maybe delved deeply into in your own training. And you may afterwards reflect on that and go, you know what, I think I need to maybe go and do a little bit of CPD within that area, maybe read a book or go into something like the Counselor CPD library and go and search that topic and delve deeper. And that is that internal supervisor. It's kind of informing you of what CPD you might do, in the same way as you might go to your supervisor and say, I've got this client, they're presented with this, and the supervisor may say, have you got knowledge and training in that area? If you say no, the supervisor is going to guide you. So there's maybe an example, an active example of that internal supervisor. And I think that you're 100% right, Rory, in saying that if you take this topic to your supervisor and say, how can I develop my internal supervisor? Ask your supervisor, what are the processes that you go through when you're working with me in supervision? And if your supervisor can walk you through that, then you have like a framework to kind of map your internal supervisor to. Now, I know, Rory, we in Counselling Tutor, we offer a clinical supervision training course. And in fact, if you're listening to this in real time, we have our next intake in January 2023. And if you're interested in finding out more about that, go to counsellingtutor.com. Just scroll down on our main page and you'll see our supervision training, and you can join the update list and we'll send you all the information about that. But within that training, so often we get feedback from those undertaking the training of how it is improving their practice. Their practice with their clients. Yes, they're learning to be supervisors, but what's happening is they're learning a framework of how supervision works, and then are able to kind of look at themselves in practice. And all it is doing is strengthening that internal supervisor, Rory.
Absolutely, Ken. And I like the term strengthening, because I think it speaks to how we develop as practitioners. And one of the things that comes up a lot, it comes up for me during my years of practice, and it comes up in supervision, is the relationship with the client, I think one of the things the internal supervisor speaks to is when you're working with a client and you may get this sense of, I'm not sure I'm in the relationship here. I'm more outside it. I'm not connecting. And, I'm just not feeling it, to be honest. And I think that is the internal supervisor saying, hey, there's something going on here. What the hell's going on with you, as a counselor? What's going on there? And that's the time to take that to supervision and say, if I was sharing a journey on a train, and there was myself and the client in the train with no stops between Manchester and London, and there's only two of us in the carriage, why would I sit at the opposite end of the train to my client? And it's at that point the supervisor is going to be looking at, who is this client to you? What is the relationship? Is there anything that's brought up from the past? And of course, we're into the realms of my favorite topic, which is transference and countertransference. And it's all part of being an effective, being an effective practitioner, but it's also being part of an effective supervisee. I don't think there's a lot spoken about how to be a useful and a productive supervisee. We go to supervision. I've never seen anything taught on it, to be honest, apart from the lectures we have in the counselling tutor library, the CSR library. So it helps you present the material better. The internal supervisor sets you up to be able to go and see a clinical supervisor and say, this is where I am. This is what I'm feeling. What's going on? Can we work it out together, Ken?
Yeah. You know what might be handy here, Rory, is if we share the supervision triangle. So the supervision triangle is covered in our supervision training course, and just looking at the areas of the supervision triangle. Because as you're kind of talking about what might come up, Rory, I'm kind of mapping it to the supervision triangle. When we were speaking about maybe you recognize that there's an area of CPD that you might need to go and do. What area of the supervision triangle might that fall into, Rory?
Well, I would think that would be the restorative side, where you may want some support. If I'm hearing you correctly, Ken, you may be a bit unsure, not feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome. Part of that would be the restorative. In other words, the supervisor would help to kind of find out what's going on for you, try and give you some balance and equilibrium in your practice. And of course, the other two sides of the triangle are it's formative, normative, and restorative. So normative is usually the ethical side of things, and the formative side is usually information and educative process. And within supervision, it kind of ebbs and flows in the supervision session. Sometimes someone comes in for support, and through that arc of normative support, bringing things back to normal, you may need to help with some education, and that would be the formative. Or you may have to look at the ethical framework, and that would be the normative side. So it's really, really important. It really, the internal supervisor in its development helps plug you in to your supervision. I think that's the best way I can do it. You could plug yourself in, yes, download yourself, and then, you and your supervisor can look at what the hell's going on. What's going on? So I say, what's going on? What's going on here? And you can work it out together. It's an essential ingredient. It really is, to be, I think, a competent, caring, and thoughtful practitioner, Ken.
Yeah, and it protects you as well. I mean, you spoke about that restorative quadrant. It's not a quadrant, because that would make it four, isn't it? It's corner of the triangle.
Yes.
I'm trying to be fancy here. Of the supervision triangle. And it may well be that you're kind of just about to go into a session with a client and you go, wow, I'm tired, my energy levels are down, and you may then decide, you know what, I think I need to take a break. I think I need a little bit of personal time. Maybe I'm going to go on a retreat, or I'm going to go away for a weekend with family or something. I'm going to let my clients know that I'm going to be taking a short break, and that's restorative. That's the internal supervisor recognizing, hold on, I'm feeling a little bit tired in this, I'm not able to be there fully. So you probably have that internal supervisor anyway. But there are two takeaways from this. Takeaway number one is you've got to get Rory's super duper handout on the internal supervisor. And you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com. That is the main website. That's where it all happens in Counselling Tutor. Click on the podcast tab, go to episode 244. 244, that's today's episode. And right there on that page, you can download your internal supervisor handouts free of charge. Just pop in your email address and we will send that to you. Takeaway number two, if you have a maturity in your practice, so you've practiced for 2 years and you feel that you are ready to undertake clinical supervision training, for your own development, for the development of your internal supervisor, and of course, so that you can be there in service of others and your supervisees who will come to you, then now's a great time to look at that if you consider Counselling Tutor for your studies, because we are about to launch that. January 2023 is our next intake. Our intakes sell out very, very quickly. You can put your name on the waiting list by going to counsellingtutor.com. Just scroll a little bit down on the front page and you'll see the clinical supervision training, and add your name to the update list. We'll send you all the information. In fact, you'll get the training handbook straight away as you sign up.